Good evening. My name is Hani Mohammad. I'm director of the Transportation Center, and I would like to welcome you to the second distinguished Leon Moses lecture in transportation. We had hoped that the person that we're honoring, the late Leon Moses, would be with us today. Unfortunately, he passed away a few weeks ago. And so he of course, cannot be here with us. But to celebrate his accomplishments and to continue in the tradition that he has started here at the Transportation Center, we have a distinguished economist who will be delivering the lecture today. But my job is not to introduce him. My job is to introduce the person who will be introducing him and also saying more about the Leon Moses lecture. So I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Ron Breutigam, who is Associate Provost for Academic Affairs here at Northwestern and a member of the from the Economics Department here at Northwestern, of course, longtime affiliate and friend of the Transportation Center. Ron?
I'd like to join Hani in welcoming everyone here to the 2013 Leon N. Moses Distinguished Lecture in Transportation. As I look around this room tonight, I see many of my colleagues, people who've known Leon for years and years. We valued him as a teacher, a mentor, a colleague, a friend. Leon arrived at Northwestern in 1959, which is hard to believe. Now, Ian Savage and I have actually shared all kinds of lecture materials over the years, so I'm going to use one of his slides to just talk a little bit about some of Leon's background. So he came from Harvard, PhD in 1952, where he was studying, as it says on the slide, input-output analysis, transportation and industrial location. Came to Northwestern in 1959, so he was a member of our community for over 50 years, which is pretty astounding. Ian, I have no idea where you got this picture, but did you get it from Diana? I don't know. Is that right? I would not have recognized this, but Leon did a lot of work in urban and regional economics and spatial location models, and brought those kinds of skills to Northwestern, and then became involved in transportation research very heavily once he arrived here. It was part of what he did with urban economics as well. So when Leon came to Northwestern, he actually, over the time when he was at Northwestern, did research in lots of areas, but he actually participated in all three of the areas that faculty members are expected to contribute to: research, good teaching, and, research, good teaching, and also as in service as an administrator. So he participated. He was chair of the Department of Economics, president of the Regional Science Association. He was director of the Transportation Center. So he did a wonderful job in all three areas. Obviously, as an administrator, he had a reputation of being a very fine administrator. And when he became director of the Transportation Center in 1974, he brought with him a wonderful vision and seemingly boundless energy in creating a group that was drawn from Kellogg, what was the school of, Graduate School of Management, I think at that time is what we called it, but the business school, the law school, arts and sciences, and the engineering school. He had faculty from all of these, about a dozen faculty involved in creating a wonderful, vibrant entity called the Transportation Center. It had already existed before, but Leon was at the helm when the Transportation Center became elevated to really have sort of a reputation internationally. He added to that faculty a mixture of business advisory committee comprised of many illustrious industry leaders, and they helped to support the center not only financially but also intellectually by helping us, the faculty, to understand what kinds of problems industry would care about and how we might be able to approach the research as well. And he became a catalyst himself. He created the fertile environment that enabled the faculty to produce a very large body of research, highly regarded nationally and internationally, relevant to the policy issues of the time, and extraordinary in its interdisciplinary nature. So these were wonderful contributions of Leon, I think, during the time when he was bringing along this transportation center. So I'm going to say a few words about Leon, and then I'm going to say some things further about, Ian. But in terms of his research, as you can see from the slide that Ian had prepared, his research did move with the times. He started with these spatial economics and urban type models, and then his research switched into economics of transportation, regulation, deregulation. As you may recall, in this 1970s, there was a wave of deregulation that swept across the face of American industry, including basically all the transportation sectors at that time. As director, he brought national attention to the center by organizing two major conferences, one on airlines and one on motor carriers. And then he moved on to talk about not only economic deregulation, but analyzing the safety aspects of transportation, including areas like the risks from transporting hazardous materials. So, a wonderful, distinguished research career. On Leon's influence as a master teacher and mentor, his colleagues have always valued him for his not only for his own research, but also for his willingness to engage other people as they did research. He insisted on the kind of intellectual honesty that goes along with, that characterizes the very best academic research. He was a wonderful teacher of microeconomics and transportation economics. With his courses being viewed among the very best on campus, students flocked to his courses, even though, and those of you who know Leon know this is the case, he had this tough demeanor, and students knew that he was a hard grader, but they knew they were going to learn. They knew that he would bring excitement into the classroom, and he would show students how concepts could be applied to problems in everyday life. So he set a wonderful stage for many of us who have been able to benefit from his efforts over the years. And it's quite fitting this evening that the 2013 Leon N. Moses Distinguished Lecture in Transportation will be presented by one of Leon's longtime colleagues in the Department of Economics and in the Transportation Center. Ian graduated with honors in economics from the University of Sheffield, and he earned his doctorate from the School of Economic Studies in the Institute for Transport Studies at the University of Leeds. And I can see several parallels in the careers of Leon and Ian. Ian, as an administrator, I think those of us who have had a chance in the Department of Economics and the Transportation Center to watch him since about 1989 know that he has kept the economics department running like clockwork, despite the fact it's large and very vibrant. And several chair people probably would not have been chair people if Ian had not been there to support their efforts. And since 2001, he's also served as director of the minor in transportation and logistics. At one time, he actually served as associate director of the Transportation Center. A parallel in the area of research in transportation. Like Leon, Ian's made valuable contributions to the literature in transportation research. In Ian's case, primarily, I'll say especially, in urban public transportation and the economics of transportation safety, though that certainly wouldn't encompass it all. His work in urban transportations dealt with the economics of transit finances and operations, the impacts of competition and privatization, and that began with his doctoral research on the liberalization or deregulation, I would have phrased it perhaps, with the bus industry in the UK. And of course, he's extended that analysis to other types of mass transit. His interest in transportation safety has spanned more than 20 years. I think it's probably the most consistent theme, but Ian, you might want to disagree with that. Beginning with his work as coordinator for a major conference on the impacts of economic deregulation. Shortly after he came to Northwestern, he did this on the airline industry, the trucking and trucking industry, looking at the safety in the United States. And there was a conference volume that was published out of this by Oxford University Press. He then turned to the railroad industry, and that research led to the publication of The Economics of Railroad Safety, a Kluwer academic publisher's book in 1998, and of course several articles following on that. And then, as noted in the flyer announcing this talk, Ian chairs the Special Interest Group on Safety within the World Conference on Transportation Research, and he has served on the organizing committees of both local and national professional organizations. He's a member of the Transportation Research Board's committee overseeing the research and development of activities on the Federal Railroad Administration. And finally, I just want to say there's some other publications, 3 articles and handbooks and a bunch of other things that he's contributed. So finally, I just want to talk about Ian a little bit as a teacher, because this parallels Leon once again. To give you an idea about Ian's wonderful reputation in the classroom, I took the liberty of excerpting a few comments from student evaluations in his Economics 355, which is the Economics of Transportation class. Savage is an awesome professor, and I really enjoyed this topic. Very relevant and practical. Savage shapes the course so that you learn about economics and transportation, how they're part of your everyday life. I like this one, and I did a double take when I read this. Savage is awesome. I love English professors. What does that have to do with transportation? But of course, they're talking about his charming English accent, not English as a discipline. And then one final one, and I could have given many more. There was one review that I saw that I thought it reads like an exit interview for students. One of the most reflective comments I've ever seen in a course evaluation. I've looked at lots of them. And it goes like this. It's also perhaps the best run class I've ever seen. And Ian is Mr. Organization. Brings all major microeconomics concepts together in one class and applies them to the transportation industry. In other words, the prerequisites for this class actually matter. And if you've taken them, the class will remind you why you pay $40,000 a year to go here. I tip my cap to Ian Savage. However, as a graduating senior, this is the last course evaluation I'm ever going to write. All right, so I also tip my cap to Northwestern, and there's a serious side to this. Northwestern in general. I'm normally the person who criticizes first and compliments later, but I'm the first to admit the economics department at this school is solid, and the rest of the courses I've taken here were top-notch as well. Northwestern's trained me well, and I'm going to miss this place. I thought that was a wonderful statement, a very thoughtful statement by a student leaving the university. And so, Ian, you made what a nice evaluation and a good thing to have written about you. So I'll close here. I'll say, Ian, Leon once told me you were one of the best hires, and maybe it was the best hire that he had ever made at Northwestern. I know John Panzer was involved in this too. And later I thought about that comment, and in light of the fact that I was also one of the people that Leon helped hire at this university. I was recruited by Dale Mortensen and Leon at the time. Joel was, I'm sure, part of the interviewing committee at that time as well. But I don't recall that Leon ever said anything like that about my being one of the best people he had hired. It's a little late to ask Leon for clarification, but no clarification is needed on the point that you are one of his best hires, and we are all grateful to him for that. So please join me in welcoming Ian Savage to talk about the economics of transportation safety.
Thank you very much, Ron. That's way too complimentary. Obviously, I'd been arranged to give this talk now for months, and I'd originally thought that Leon would be sitting here. I was going to use this photograph, and actually my line was going to be to Leon that 2 of us look much older, but one person in that photograph still looks the same, right? And, this was actually Halloween 1989. It was the release date of the book that came out of the Transportation and Safety Conference. So taken at the bottom of the stairs in the Transportation Center's old and much beloved building at 1936 Sheridan, right? So what I want to do today is give you a talk about how economists think about transportation safety. So that's kind of what I'm going to do. So it's kind of a balance between having some academic respectability to it, plus the fact that it's this hour in the evening. So we have to kind of balance off the objectives here. If economists think about safety in general, I'll just put this quote up here. This was, I actually found out about 2 days ago, this person who wrote this, who was a member of this commission, which led to that setting up of that, of the Consumer Product Safety Commission by that well-known socialist, Richard Nixon. This Corwin Edwards, who was a person on it, was actually a faculty member at Northwestern in the late 1940s. I may have gone into the 50s as well. So this is kind of what economists think. So this kind of gives us our reputation of really being somewhere between the chief economic assistant to the Grim Reaper and proving that we really are the deadly science. So that's kind of what we believe as economists. Now, I just want to say a couple of things before we talk about some of the economics here, and that's kind of what are the risks. One of the things I did for a book for Brookings, which I then updated because I was teaching in my class and I realized the stuff was from the 1990s, I should do some more recent stuff, was to try and work out what sort of risks do we have in transportation and safety. Now, when we do so, I do want to actually, so one thing we get into this line of work is you have to kind of change your vocabulary. So the word accidents kind of disappears out of your vocabulary. It has certain formal definitions in certain transportation modes. Most of the time we don't use that because typically economists would argue that while these are not intentional acts, the same way that, say, terrorism or suicides are, they aren't exactly accidental either because people have usually made decisions along the way about avoiding them or not avoiding these incidents. So as you've seen when you listen to anyone talking about highway incidents, the word crashes is used professionally there, or the word incident. So you kind of eradicate that from your speech. So in terms of the magnitude of the risk, it's actually quite a lot of people die in transportation crashes each year. The stunning thing, I think, is the second category, which is if you exclude illnesses and things like that, of unintentional injury deaths, 38% of these, basically 2 out of 5 of these occur in transportation incidents. And it's actually, not only is it the largest cause of unintentional injury deaths, it's actually bigger than numbers 2 and 3 combined. So it's just huge, right? And while, of course, the numbers have trended down somewhat in the decade between 2000 and 2009, the total number of fatalities in all transportation modes was just over 43,000 a year. Of course, most of this is on the highway, but wasn't exclusively on the highway. So I was going to kind of put together some data on this. So that 43,000, the vast majority, about 85%, are in private transportation. That's where you're driving your own car or you're piloting your own maritime vessel, flying a private general aviation aircraft. So only 15% are in the bits which, shall we say, get all the headline space on the newspapers, which is in commercial transportation. Now, I did decide to just put this up here. I used this in a BAC meeting earlier this year, and Paul Nowicki, we had a discussion here that this main thing to take away from here is don't let your daughter date a guy who rides a motorcycle, right? So there's quite a variety of cross modes. One thing actually I find very interesting is the fact that riding the buses seems to be an incredibly safe way of travel down there. So there's quite a variety here. But and also just sort of talk about trends here, just to show you some quick data on various modes. This is highway fatalities per vehicle mile. This is, all of them are over a 35-year period from 1975 to 2010, which I did for a journal article. This is an index, 1975 equals 100. So we're down about, so we say about a third of what it was in 1975 on the highways. On the railroads, if you just look at, there's a lot of ways you can think of railroad safety. This is collisions and derailments. Again, quite a substantial drop. And the interesting thing here is the huge drop immediately after deregulation and a reverse going on in the late 70s. Probably you would argue that things have been kind of drifting along at roughly the same level, going down somewhat in recent decades, but clearly not as much as what happened in the early 1980s. And in aviation, as we know, there's been, if we'd taken this data back, of course, to 1950, it would have been even more dramatic, right? But here we see a continual drop over the entire time period where we've got the dots of the actual data, and the red line is the 5-year moving average. So in nearly every mode, we've had huge improvements. So everything bad you might hear from me this evening, you put in the context the fact that things have been improving a lot, right? So I have always argued that, of course, the big part of the elephant here is in the private transportation. But it's the sort of thing which I, as an economist, can't get too worked up about in terms of professional interest. And so here's just some random facts here, which I don't think imply anything, except for the fact that why I, as an economist, am not so interested in automobile crashes. seems to be that economists certainly are involved in some of this insurance setting, cost-benefit analysis, but human factors research and automotive engineering just seems to me to be so much more prevalent in this particular mode. So the bit which, of course, as economists we're interested in is commercial transportation, because then there's actually a trade going on. You've got the passengers and the shippers, they're contracting with the firms, and the firms are making decisions, the carrier firms making decisions about their safety. So that's, I find a lot more interesting as an economist. Now, if we kind of look at what the split of this, about 15% of total fatalities are, nearly all of them, about 80% of them, aren't actually people involved in the production or the consumption of commercial transportation services at all. They're actually private transportation users. So who are these people? These are people, automobile drivers who are in collisions with trucks, automobile drivers in collision with trains at grade crossings, pedestrians, trespassers on the railroad. So that's what all that group of people are. The next group are the employees, which we realize that's actually a pretty big number as well, which is why you can see in a lot of transportation modes why labor is clearly a big mover of the discussion on transportation issues, because here we're talking about fatalities, but you've got a whole sort of industrial injuries and all that sort of thing going on as well. And actually, when you look at sort of data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, you realize what the rates for 1,000 employees of fatalities and injuries, you see certain things, right? First thing you see is that they don't call that show the deadliest catch. They have a good reason they call it that, right? But things I kind of bring your mind to is the taxi and limousine is kind of high because half of these are homicides, okay? But if you start looking at other things, trucking and water transportation, you're talking about risks which are twice that of working in construction. And even when you get down to sort of what you might regard as the safer end of transportation, you're talking about risks which are 2 to 3 times working for utility companies or working in manufacturing. So, I mean, and clearly this is understandable. We're dealing with heavy machinery out in the open air, probably far from immediate medical care. So, I mean, in many ways this is kind of understandable, but this is clearly why labor issues are a big deal in thinking about transportation safety. So, actually, when we talk about the elephant, the little bit of the tail of the elephant is the bit that makes the front page of the paper. Yeah. And so each year, on average, the last decade, about 175 passengers in all modes combined die a year in this country. So it's a very small proportion, but clearly the one which drives public opinion. So now we're going to get around some kind of economics. You'll be pleased to know that we are going to have diagrams, right? There's no equations. There's one Greek letter during this, right? But no equations, okay? So, okay. So how much safety should there be, or how safe is safe enough? Well, here's the bit where I'm going to kind of keep your eyelids open at this point, right? Let's think about some sort of the cost side of providing transportation safety. So let's think along this axis, you could think of something which is kind of a probability type relationship, except it's the reverse of a crash probability. Over here, where there's no safety and a crash is certain to occur on a particular trip, and over there we've got perfect safety, which generally, of course, is an idealized concept where crashes never occur. And we're going to look at the cost per trip. So the first thing you can think of is something which is kind of, you might regard as pretty obvious, which is the fact the more safety you want, the more it's going to cost you. So you'd have some sort of, what I'm going to call prevention costs here. So that's the kind of things you incur in advance. Training and maintaining equipment and things like that. Now, for years, I'd thought about this in a very traditional sense, you know, as I say, training, buying equipment and things. But then I had a total epiphany on this when I was doing some work with a PhD student at Western Australia, and I got to read some aviation work. And so this is the thing that changed my mind when I was reading a book, and it all started with this, which on the left you see an Air New Zealand DC-10, and on the right you see Mount Erebus, which is a volcano off of the coast of Antarctica. It's a 12,000-foot volcano. And Air New Zealand in the late 70s were running a trip from day trip where you'd have wine, no doubt dinner, and you'd have a nice low pass over Antarctica and you'd do some sightseeing, right? This plane was flying at 1,500 feet. This mountain is 12,000 feet, and I think you can guess what happened, right? But that's kind of not exactly the point I'm making here. The big point was when they held the inquiry into this, of course, Chief Inspector of Air Accidents in New Zealand came to the conclusion, which you normally do here, blame the pilots for flying this plane at 1,500 feet when there was a big mountain nearby. Now, there's a really long backstory to this, which is, I guess this is what Google is for, right? So you can read this at your leisure. But needless to say, as with most transportation incidents, there's a thing that happened immediately before, and then there's the long backstory here. And what was very unusual here is they set up a royal commission 2 years later, and by a Supreme Court justice in New Zealand, and he kind of brought out this whole sort of backstory, and there was kind of, not only was there a backstory, but there was actually a cover-up by Air New Zealand to basically pin it on the pilots and the fact that this precursor events never occurred. So the reason I brought that up is this led to a lot of rethinking of how you investigate air crashes. And totally, if you'd had the guy who's head of the, we had the guy who's head of NTSB giving a Patterson lecture the other year, and he made reference to the things that came out of this. And a person who did some work which really came out of this is a man called James Reason. He's a professor of psychology in Manchester in England. And if anyone wants to read this, this is probably, from a transportation point of view, probably the best place to start reading about this. And there were a number of different incidents. There was an Air Ontario crash in Dryden, Ontario in '89, which people talk about a lot. But the Air New Zealand thing was kind of where people started out on that. And basically what James Reason's idea was the fact that for incidents to occur, you have always have hazardous conditions. We know that in transportation. There's always bad weather, things break, people make mistakes. We all know this goes on, right? This is unavoidable. But what you do is you put a whole bunch of defenses and sort of little sort of redundant systems to try and catch these. But every redundant system you have always has a little flaw to it. None of them are perfect, right? And therefore, something really bad to happen, all of these little flaws, which came to be known as the Swiss cheese theory, basically have to be lined up so that the hazards actually turn into some sort of bad thing happening. So most of the time, one of these defenses will catch what's going on. And this was a real revelation to me because now I could think about the costs of how you produce safety. And particularly the fact of, you can imagine the more layers of Swiss cheese you have, the lower the probability that the actual holes will line up on the situation. For those of you who are sort of in the rail transportation business, if you think about the horrible events that occurred in Quebec this past summer, just think of there where everything that could have gone wrong in that situation did go wrong. And you only needed one thing to have happened differently that this thing would have been averted or the seriousness much reduced. So this Swiss cheese theory has become a big deal in how people think about transportation crashes. And what James Reason and his guys are doing nowadays is working in healthcare applications where, again, you could imagine similar sort of arguments go on. So, okay. So that suggests to me that if we have this prevention cost function, the actual nature of it is really unclear because you've got not only sort of the obvious things, the maintenance and things like this, but you've now got all these defenses. And the way they kind of work together to kind of produce a level of safety is really tough to know what it is. So that's one side of things. Now, of course, the other side is that when crashes do occur, obviously there are costs, right? You damage your equipment. If you're a freight shipper, you damage the cargo. There may be damage to third parties as well, or legal settlements and everything. So if you're over here and the crash was certainly occurred, there's certainly those costs. And if we're in the ideal situation over there, you would never incur these costs because no crashes occur. But because there's kind of a probability along there, you can think of a line there which basically measures the, shall we say, the ex post payments you have to do. Now, when you combine those together, you get kind of an expected cost of different levels of safety, which is the cost you incur beforehand and the probability you incur a cost afterwards. So this kind of bottoms out at some point. So what you observe in life is that only the right-hand side of this continuum of options is actually provided, because you never produce over here, because you could simultaneously reduce your costs and produce a product which is more attractive to the consumer. So only the bit over there, people would want to produce that. And you see kind of what you can see, that you have potentially higher safety options available at a higher cost, simultaneously with lower cost safety ones available at a lower cost. So here's when economists then do that, of course, they then bring in the demand side to this, and you have a model which in the most basic model has many consumers buying one unit at a time, and you engineer it in such a way that you have a downward sloping demand curve, which is what we normally expect in economics. So people have different values of just shipping or traveling, irrespective of the safety aspects of it. So you have this going on in the background. So here's the bit which I said is almost an equation here. So let's say safety lives in this continuum between 0 and 1, which is kind of the reverse probability of an incident occurring. The important thing is that different consumers value safety differently from each other, which is this Greek letter, which I said would appear up theta, which is going to be valued differently by different consumers. And we're going to show you how this kind of works in a second, right? Now, one thing I would say here is the fact that theta is greater than 0. So everybody agrees that more safety is better than less safety, right? None of us disagree on that, right? It's just that some of us value it more than other people do. Now, I think it's easy to see this from a freight point of view. If you're shipping around expensive electronics, you really care about whether this stuff gets there, right? If you're shipping around gravel, well, you know, the truck turns over, that's kind of sad, right? You kind of scoop it up, you stick it back in there, you know, and it's bad, but it's not that bad, right? You know, so you can understand this from a freight point of view. Whether it exists from a passenger point of view is clearly a matter of some discussion, shall we say. And that actually is, you could think how people could be arrayed from, say, theta h, which is the people who value this the highest, down to a continuum where there's people who value it the lowest. The big problem is we have no idea what this range is. I can't think of a single academic paper or any sort of paper which has attempted for either freight or passengers to kind of specify what this kind of continuum is. What's the bottom and top end of valuation? We probably have some middle idea for value of statistical life, which is the US Department of Transportation, and other people have standard values on there, which is about 9 million a life at the moment for cost-benefit purposes. But we don't know too much about the distribution of how people might vary around that. So why is this kind of important? Well, the important point is that we think about a marginal cost of safety. And that comes from the fact that you've got this function here, which isn't the marginal cost of safety, but the slope of it is. And the way you've drawn it, you can see that not only is more safety more expensive, but as you can imagine, getting the last little bit of probability out is really expensive. So this is not only sloping upwards, but it's actually bending upwards as well. Okay? So you can basically think of the fact you have a marginal cost of safety. It's increasing. And at least in that benchmark model, because economists always want to have some benchmark which we can compare things against, you end up with a competitive model where price is driven down towards marginal cost, which we're going to relax in a few minutes. And then basically what goes on is the consumers purchase more safety until their theta just equals the sort of the marginal price of an increment of safety. So you're going to end up with person A, who has a theta there, who wants to buy preferably that level of safety, and someone else who values it more, who wants to buy more safety. Which is kind of, I think that's pretty intuitive. The big problem is that, well, what we next can say is that we can then sort of map these valuations into the fact that some subset of the potential range of safety that firms would provide, this valuation would match onto actual offerings. And the people who value it the most would want to buy the highest ones. People who value it the least would want to buy towards the bottom end. So this is where a range of demand would be, which probably is not going to go all the way up to perfect safety, because hardly any of us could afford this, even if it actually even existed. And maybe even the people who kind of don't value it so much don't want to go down to S minimum. Okay, they might want a bit more than that, right? But this is just illustrative. The big problem, of course, we have is that we really have no idea about the distribution of consumers between these 2 points. Okay, so if we did know what this distribution was, and we could at least say in certain markets, firms would kind of line themselves up to kind of cater to the taste here. If that was true of the distribution, you'd have a lot of firms who would kind of line themselves up here to service these people and a few less over there and over there. Okay? Now, probably the market that most closely approximates this is probably truckload trucking. Okay? Where probably, when you look out there and across all the different firms in this industry, if you wanted to get high quality trucking services and pay a premium price for it, you can go and find this stuff. There are firms that cater to this. And if you want to consume at the bottom end, well, there's those types of firms as well. So probably, at least in this market, you've actually got something which kind of approximates this. The only problem we have is we don't really have much evidence about what the shape of this distribution is. Now, there's certain implications here. Implication number one, of course, is that consumers may rationally choose less than perfect safety. I think this is sort of, an economist can say this without blinking an eye, but for a regular person, this is not so easily taken on board. Next thing I think economists wouldn't be too worried about is the fact that lower and higher safety options may coexist, though certainly when you sort of see the discussion in the popular press on this, evidence of diversity of safety offerings to the common press would indicate that something's wrong. Man, we've got this firm who's less safe than that firm. This is bad. Most economists would say that's good, right? Because this is reflecting a diversity of tastes. And the last thing of it is the fact that the lower safety offerings reflect a lower taste for safety by some shippers and passengers. Now, I think that's kind of interesting because in some ways, when we see, for example, a bad trucking firm out there, probably the reason why this bad trucking firm is out there is the fact that there are shippers who are perfectly happy with this type of service being provided by that trucking firm. And I always get the feeling when I hear the discussion about this that in some ways the shippers who actually demand service from these type of bottom-end trucking firm are just shocked, absolutely shocked when they find out they're actually engaged a lower quality trucking firm. It's like you're driving the getaway car, but then you're saying, hey, I've got nothing to do with what went on here, right? You know? Something's going on. Now, I think the implication here is we ask ourselves, how much safety should there be? Well, the problem here is that we really don't know. So if someone asks me how safe is safe enough, I've got to tell you, I don't know the answer to that question. And I don't know the answer to that question partly because I have a limited knowledge about how safety is produced. I have limited knowledge about what the distribution of the consumer's tastes are. And we have kind of tough knowledge of even what sort of market structure is actually driving the provision of different levels of safety. So I only actually know of one paper which has ever tried to bring all this together. And it's actually a very good paper by someone I really respect. But they did it for a monopoly railroad, which is kind of the easiest case because you haven't got competitive effects going on. You've got one size fits all trying to fit everyone. So it's kind of the simplest case. Now, I did want to say something next about, even though we may not know how much safety there is, we do actually know quite a bit about deviations from the optimal levels of safety. And there was a bunch of assumptions that live in the sort of basic model here. One assumption is, and we discussed the fact there are many carriers and prices driven down to competition. Now, obviously, if there's only a limited number of carriers, you only got a certain number of offerings. So not everybody's going to be exactly satisfied. So I won't say too much more about that. The ones I will say is a bit more of, it's clear there's a big assumption here that consumers are fully informed, and even if they actually were fully informed, that they make decisions in some sort of rational sense. Now, let's think about an example here, which I've kind of tried to illustrate here. Let's just say a very simplified thing where we have two firms. So it's not competitive, there are two firms, and these two firms are trying to locate themselves in order to attract the customer of a variety of passengers or shippers who have a variety of tastes and safety. Typically, these firms will kind of diverge from each other to lessen price competition. So I've just drawn them in random places here. So carrier number one kind of puts itself up there as a higher price, high safety firm. And there are a bunch of shippers or passengers who are in that purple area who kind of gravitate to this firm. That's the one that best matches their particular desires. And you've got firm carrier two, who offers less safety, lower price. And there are a bunch of people in that green area who kind of gravitate to this firm. And then there may be certain people, perhaps in the middle and perhaps at the two ends, where these two firms, while they're offering choices, these choices are so far away from their preferences, they just prefer not to consume rather than shift to one of these other firms. But this sort of story here does presume that all the consumers can actually know where these two firms are and actually act on this information. So the big question you ask yourself is, what happens if consumers are totally uninformed here? Well, if we asked Janet Yellen's husband here, who's a Nobel Prize-winning economist, George Akerlof, he would basically argue that it would be a kind of a race to the bottom going on here, his so-called Lemons model, where basically if consumers could not tell the difference between these two firms, they had no information really they believed on the safety of these two firms, they would just say, hey, we just want low price, and both these firms would just race to the bottom. Now, clearly, in reality, we do not see this going on. What we see is the fact that there is some differentiation going on, and there doesn't seem to be a race to the bottom, which means that, in some ways, consumers must be able to recognize notorious carriers. Even if they can't tell the difference between a lot of the firms, they must tell the people who are really bad. But the big problem is we really have next to no information about how and what and how consumers learn and what information they use and how they translate into their actions. And we really don't have too much information about, for example, Carrier One, who's the high safety firm in this case. How does Carrier One signal to the customers that I'm high quality? And do it in a way which is kind of credible, rather than thinking it's just hot air they're saying, right? And really, we have next to no information about that. It's tough to think of almost any papers in transportation which kind of talk about how that occurs. So what we can observe is that we're probably going to have some markets which there does seem to be a lot of dispersion on the basis of safety. We have industries where there are many carriers, like truckload trucking. Consumers have varied tastes. Consumers are not bundled together. Clearly, one of the things that happens in transportation, as soon as you're in LTL trucking or in the railroad business or the airline business, you've got all these people who may have differences in taste, but you stick them all together on the same vehicle, on the same plane, same truck, same train, and you're providing a common safety to all of these people. One size fits all. So what economists would call economies of density are going on here, or maybe some economies of scope between different groups of demand. So clearly when consumers are bundled together, you're not going to expect to have much diversity. But if you're in the truckload trucking business, then you can expect to have a lot more diversity. But it does require that consumers are well informed. They can tell the difference between high quality firms and low quality firms. And economists call this sort of market vertically differentiated. And in contrast, there's going to be very little dispersion when you have obviously very few firms. right? If consumers have similar tastes, then clearly you won't expect much diversion. If you have this sort of bundling together of one size fits all, all people on the same vehicle, and also if it's difficult to determine safety or differentiate between them. I'm convinced the reason why most mainstream airlines have basically identical safety is the fact that consumers really couldn't make a choice between them. And if you can't infer that someone's providing a much higher than the average level of safety at a higher price, why would you patronize them? You might just think they're just charging a high price. How can I confirm that they're actually providing me with a higher quality product? The next assumption is that there are third-party effects. All third-party effects are internalized by the carrier. So you know you might have externalities on third parties. If the legal system works, all of this should get worked into the equilibrium. But in reality, this doesn't often happen, right? There are legal constraints and things like that. And I want to tell you roughly what happens when we have these third-party effects. This is a diagram we had a bit earlier. If some of the third-party effects are not internalized by the firm through the legal system, what happens is the left-hand end of that line that slopes down at an angle gets pulled down because some of these costs are no longer transferred onto the firm. They're borne by public authorities, other parties which aren't compensated. So if that happens, what you do is you actually pull that line down and you're pulling the expected cost down. So two things happen here. So externalities are uncompensated, have a kind of a double whammy here. Whammy number one is there is an area of safety provision here, which in the event there are any shippers who want to take you up on this offer, you could have some lower safety options being provided. The second whammy, which may not be immediately obvious, is the fact you're pulling down the costs to the firm of safety, and hence the price of transportation is going down. So the second whammy is that because the price of transportation falls, you've got increased exposure at all safety levels to the third parties. So that's the thing that really is bad for the third parties here. So that's what goes on with externalities. The final assumption is that carriers themselves make rational choices. Now, I'm going to argue that basically that combined with those two other things in red interact probably for the market failure which causes the sort of the greatest concern that you see out there. And the market failure occurs in the following way. Here's this diagram we had before. There's a prevention cost, the things that occur before the crash, and then the things that occur after the crash. Now, if you're a firm, that bit there, those costs are incurred for sure now, right? You're spending this now on maintenance, training, these defenses and things, right? But the things over here are possibly incurred, right? In the sense this is a probabilistic cost that occurs to you, right? Even if you're the scummiest trucking firm, it's possible your crash may not occur for another 3 years, okay? So I think it's very easy in these circumstances to kind of start discounting or being myopic about these costs that could occur in the future. You're very aware of what's going on now, but you could discount what's going on in the future. And basically the argument here is that you're going to either end up with some unintentional or some intentional avaricious myopia going on. And basically the way I think of it is let's say you're sitting there in the boardroom and there's a conversation going on between the vice president of maintenance and the CFO. And the CFO says, why are you doing all this stuff? And the maintenance guy says, well, we've got to have all these defenses in place in case all these things go wrong. And the CFO says, well, show me when this has actually been at all useful in preventing a crash in the last 10 years. And the maintenance guy's kind of on his back heels now trying to promote this. So I think when you start thinking about the Swiss cheese type argument, you can start seeing why it can be very attractive to act in a myopic fashion. You can start pulling out costs which on the face of it don't seem to lead to an accident tomorrow for sure, but may do. So I think myopia is a big concern that people have here. As I say, it's of two types. It's either unintentional, it could be avaricious, and it basically requires, though, the consumers not to notice what you're doing. Because if you're starting pulling out costs and then all consumers said, hey, these guys are cheapening their product, then in some ways you defeated the objective here. So let's think about what's going on. So certainly for the unintentional myopia, I'd imagine that most of this is associated with inexperienced new entrants, where people may not be deliberately discounting the future, they're just kind of clueless of the future, right? They know what it costs now, but the fact this may cause a crash, and these crashes lead to big lawsuits for me, right? This is a shock to them, right? So I think that's the basis of some part of regulation. Now, the other part of it is kind of what is called, at least in the economics literature, cheating here, right? And this is where you have incumbent firms who basically are deviating from their past safety performance. Now, I think we should have a little competition here. You should all write down on a piece of paper which firms that you believe, no doubt they're your competitors, not you yourself, right, have engaged in this in the last 15 years, right? And we could probably all think of a whole bunch of firms who have done this, right? This is basically equivalent to what you might regard to in other regards as someone who's milking or burning a reputation. And it's generally associated with firms close to bankruptcy. That's the way when you look at the intellectual papers on this, or firms needing to get through a difficult period. I'm going to cut out some of these slices of cheese now. I hope that nothing bad happens in the next year, and then a miracle is going to happen, good times are back again, and I can put all the slices back in. Now, the big problem we have here, and this has occupied myself and my colleague John Panzer's lives for more years than both of us care to mention, the big problem is economists have real problems with this argument. And the real problem is that it's very tough for an economist to understand why people want to burn reputations. I could give you the 10-minute version on this, but I'll give you the 20-second version on this, right? The 20-second version is that a reputation is expensive to acquire, okay? And therefore, the benefit of your reputation is the fact that when you've established your reputation, then from then henceforth, you get certain benefits, which amongst other things, allow you to pay off the investment you made in making that reputation in the first place. And one of the big problems about burning your reputation is you're foregoing that stream of additional premium you can get from being high quality. So economists have real problems in equilibrium why this sort of myopia goes on. But the big problem is that we know it does. We see in the trucking industry there's churning going on all the time. There's firms establishing their reputation, firms burning their reputation. It seems to be just a continual cycle of this amongst certain parts of the industry. But working out the underlying economics of why this happens is tough. In fact, some of the models are actually counterintuitive to what you think. People burn their reputation in good times rather than bad times, for example. So that's the myopia thing. So basically remind you what this myopia thing is. If we had three firms like this, basically what goes on is, let's say carrier 3, who's kind of the middle carrier here, basically decides it's going to lower its costs, moves down market, but the only problem is it's not moving down market in terms of the consumers. The consumers, it hopes, still believe it's up there, because it could still maintain a higher price. Because if you had to lower your price when you did this, you defeated the objective of it. So that's kind of basically the idea of this. And then you assume that it's going to be a certain number of time periods before the consumers cotton on to what's going on. So we're getting towards the end here. How relatively important are these deviations? Well, here's a chart which you can peruse at your leisure. Well, I've just this comes from Ian Savage, so this isn't coming from any sort of scientific basis, right? Well, I've kind of put together some sort of star rating of how I think these different failures might exist in different modes. And what that leads, of course, you to do is thinking, well, what can we do about these failures? And that's kind of what more can we do about it? And I'll bring the same chart back up. Clearly, one thing you want to do is if you feel that there's some externalities which aren't being borne by the firm, there's probably some legal reason why some of these things are not being borne. So additional liability or legal reforms may be one thing to consider. Another thing you want to consider over here with myopia, if the myopia problem is the fact you're not taking account of the future, well, there's a mechanism for taking account of the future, and that's the insurance market. But that's only going to work if your insurance company is actually quoting you premiums which reflect the individual risk that you pose. If the premiums are being set on some sort of average basis, and the insurance company in effect is not checking up for who's cheating on the myopia, this isn't going to get you very far. So there's certainly insurance there. I think one thing which I think is very interesting is the fact that if I gave this presentation 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, how would you actually disseminate any information on safety? Now, of course, there are many people in this room at the moment who probably have very mixed feelings, some of them good and some of them bad, about, say, moves by the Motor Carrier Safety Administration to put some of their inspections of trucking firms and firms' crash rates online. I've heard people on both sides of the argument, right, and here. But this is a very interesting issue. If a lot of the safety problem is coming from misinformation, then maybe the solution to this is just stick some information out there. So I think, and we live in a world where you potentially could do it. Of course, the question is what information to give people. I mean, this is not like this is a trivial problem, right? But that's the thing. Because overarching all of these is sort of the old standby, which is sort of traditional regulation. Now, you'll be pleased to know that even though I could give another whole lecture about safety regulation, I'm not going to, right? Except to point out that the safety regulation problem is really complex, right? I mean, first of all, just the fact of working out what's the minimum acceptable safety performance. What is it? I mean, that's an interesting question. Who knows, right? Then the big question is how do you express it in terms of things that you want? Presumably as society, we don't care about inputs to safety. We care about whether we get killed or whether there's a crash or not. But that's not very useful for monitoring firms, right? You have to translate into something you can monitor, which does get into sort of truck maintenance, driver licensing and things like that. But even then you get around to the issue, what's the optimal inspection strategy? Presumably the same way that you think about the economics of policing, you're not going to have a cop on every corner. Not every crime is going to be detected. There's some optimal level of crime, some optimal level of cops on the beat. There's some optimal level of fines you adopt. Does this fines have any effect on recidivism by the firms when they get caught? So these are all interesting issues which get around to this safety regulation problem, some of which Leon and myself worked on during the 90s on truck safety issues. So here's some final thoughts, which is kind of the good bit of the evening from your point of view. What can we conclude about this? First thing is I want to say to you is that it's clearly difficult to quantify what the optimal level of safety is. If you ask the question, how safe is safe enough, the answer is we really don't know. And it's tough to us even think about how we could even calculate this based on our current level of knowledge. But as economists, we would generally argue that we would expect if there's a variety of tastes that we'd have high and low safety coexisting. Market failures are clearly rife throughout this. So even if we don't know where we should be, we can at least tell where the deviations are. And more importantly, the nature and their magnitude varies by mode. So the solutions in one mode are going to be different from the solutions in a different mode because the problem's different. And then finally, I would say that the policy responses are numerous, and each of them have their pluses and minuses, and they're all non-trivial to implement. So myself and John Pander were talking at lunch today, where we said that, you know, in pure theory, just one of these solutions, if it was done well, you would only need that. But in reality, you start observing in a pragmatic sense that all of these solutions are being deployed in some sort of combination here. And I think that's kind of a takeaway you can do. So the good thing from my point of view, and actually one of the reasons I moved into safety in the mid-1980s, because I was doing urban transit stuff, right? In 1985, everybody and his brother were dealing with deregulation and safety. And being a rational economist, I could recognize the fact that most of these people were better than I am. So I worked out this was a very bad market to be in. And I'd actually written a paper on safety, and that's kind of what raised my interest. And the more I read about it, the more I worked out, at least in transportation, is I had very little competition. So even if I wasn't very good, I'll certainly be pretty good compared with the competition. So I was thinking. But another thing I always think is the fact that there's no shortage of things to do research on here. You just think of the translation problem. We don't know what the optimal level of safety is. We don't know exactly how these market failures work and the magnitudes of them in empirical terms. And we're unsure about the effects of policy. There's continuing debates about inspection regimes and levels of penalties. So plenty of opportunity for research. So that's a good thing. Now, I do want to kind of close this up by saying something more about Leon. I was one of the speakers at Leon's funeral 2 weeks ago, where I reflected a lot more on sort of the personal side of my dealing with Leon, which is not really appropriate for this evening. But so I thought I'd actually turn to some of our alumni who had worked with Leon both as BSc members and as students. And in the last 2 weeks, there's been so many emails that come into Diana and shared them with me. So I've mercilessly stolen some of these, and I want you to have a look at these. Leon was a huge influence on my life and my career. And not just me, as I mentioned his funeral. If you look over his academic papers in your refereed journals, there was like 30 co-authors over the course of many decades. So there were many people who worked with Leon and published with Leon. It was, he worked with lots of people. So I speak on behalf of a whole cadre of people who I met. So here's some quotes here, which I'm not going to read them. You can read them. Vicky, many of you might know Vicky. She was a BAC member, I believe, at one time. I think, correct? And alumni of ours. So I knew Leon after smoking in classrooms, I'm sure, was outlawed, right? Certainly a fallen-out fashion even before it was outlawed, right? I was very taken by the gentleman that left who was here in the late 60s, and a similar age when I first met Leon. And Leon was a very, helped me in my transition to living here in many ways, and was very generous and things. And the next quote, Chuck Lounsbury, many of you might know, is a long-time BAC member, actually one of my more favorite BAC members over the years, a real sort of fun guy to be around, as well as noted professional in the transportation industry. And gentleman on the left who is, he was a professor at the Technion, I believe, at Israel after this, and then was in the Ministry of Transport, still might be, I'm sure he's retired now, in Israel, right? I thought that was very moving words from him. Especially considering he sent it on his iPhone, so he must have been sitting there tapping this out, right? Not using a keyboard, so it's, I think. So as I transition to allow us to have some to and fro in terms of what I've said this evening, I'd like to at least think about Leon, who would have been 89 a week or so ago, right? A true leader in Transportation Center. Transportation Center was set up in 1954. I believe it actually started operating in 1956, according to, he came here 3 years later. And I think nearly everything we see out there, you can trace back to Leon's vision with the group of people who were around him at that time. But I mean, Leon was clearly someone who, Leon never led from the back, did he? He was always leading from the front, right? Fantastic scholar. And despite this rather pugnacious demeanor, which I'm sure many of us had one-on-one experiences with, right? When you start realizing what went on behind the rather irascible facade, you know, you start realizing there were the financial loans made privately to overseas students who are having hard times and things like this. All these are other things which really spoke to his personal character as well. So with that, we have some time for questions. And we can still get out of here at a reasonable hour this evening. Yeah. Yes, Lee.
Do you believe the CSA scores reflect, or properly reflect safety in the trucking industry?
Okay. So what Leah's raised is, I'm going to repeat the question so it goes on to the video. Leah said that I mentioned that this provision of data, okay? And he was talking about the CSA scores, which is some of the data collected by the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, which is a variety of data on crashes, inspections, violations of the law by drivers and things like that. And you as individuals could go to the website and get this data yourself, right? Do I believe this data? Leon and I actually did work on an early version of this where we kind of reversed engineered when they just had 3 levels, you know, satisfactory, unsatisfactory, and conditional. So we kind of, based on a questionnaire which had like 70 odd questions or something right at that time. My opinion is that I'm supportive of this happening, this information being provided. What I feel it has done is it has basically removed the cloak of asymmetric information which lived over the entire industry, in the sense that bad drivers can't hide from trucking firms, their records. I remember when we started doing this work in the 80s, a lot of the truck drivers' records were just invisible to anyone. They were hidden in courthouses somewhere and not even shared within police departments. And it means that firms' histories are visible to shippers. And I think the interest, so do I think there are issues you could take question with this? Yes, I do, right? I think there are very interesting implications as an economist here, in the sense that if you think that in some ways the reason there might be bad trucking firms, some trucking firms are just cheating and just bad, right? But there are other trucking firms who are entirely upfront about what they are. They just have a bunch of shippers who patronize them, who want low safety and low quality. I think it does raise the issue then of where the liability starts lying. Whether the shippers, in some ways, leave their liability behind as soon as the truck leaves the dock. And I think that raises it, given the fact that now they are somewhat aware of what's going on. So I would say that I can see why people complain about it, but I think some of the reason, I heard some people complaining about it, and part of the reason they're complaining about it is that, you know, I've hired this driver turned out to be lousy, and now I'm saddled with this driver's reputation, or my reputation for a certain period of time. Well, my opinion is, well, that's hard luck, right? You hired this guy, right? You know, and if you didn't check him out thoroughly, or her thoroughly, and they didn't have such a good record, well, that's your problem, right? So I think I feel pretty aggressive about this, but not necessarily about whatever the algorithms are. That's my opinion, Lee. Go on.
I would share that.
Yeah.
Because we have our own trucking firm ourselves.
Right.
And what we found was that just through the governance and management process of kind of getting at what the core of the scores were, it helped facilitate our program. Right. So
Right.
we feel safer, all right, as a company because of that.
I was also, harking back to Leon, we found out that firms that actually mandated reporting of all incidents, this was data from late 80s, so it's a long time ago, right? This was firms which were mandating their drivers were reporting incidents of all severities to the management, ended up having much lower crash rates. So that said to me that firms where the management actually said, hey, I really care about this. And that's kind of what ties in with this James Reason thing to me, because at least part of what this production of safety is not physical resources in a certain sense. I mean, there's clearly maintenance and training, but part of it is people can be unattentive to their jobs, and what you could do by sort of motivating the employees or kind of indicating to the employees that safety matters, rather than something where it really doesn't matter to us, because as soon as someone gives that impression to the employees, the employee may take less care than they would do otherwise, even though they still may be a good employee in general. So that's my feeling. Joel.
So Ian, you showed us this curve before, with all these accident rates going down over time over the last 30 years. Then you showed us this little, supply and demand curve. And of course, the question comes up: what's driving the sharp decline? Is it factors on the supply side, better technology, better infrastructure, things like that, or would you think it's primarily on the demand side? The supply is changing very little, but we simply demand more safety because somehow the value of human life or perhaps our perceptions have gone up. I mean, if we knew that, presumably we'd be able to have a better position whether that decline is going to continue or whether it's going to level off or go up.
So Joe's question is whether it's coming from demand side or the supply side and this data is from the mid-70s. I feel humbled as an economist knowing that most of this decline has not come from anything that economists have had anything to do with whatsoever, in the sense that it's come from improved engine technologies on aircraft and the reduction in costs and things. Where I was discussing with one of the people here a bit earlier this evening, just the fact that the cost of a rear view camera sticking on an automobile is 20 years ago it would have been prohibitive and now it's trivial, or not totally trivial. That's the supply side things. I think there are demand side things. Some of it kind of obvious in the sense that whether it be in healthcare or other consumer safety things, we probably demand more now than we did then. So I mean, clearly, if we look back at what went on in the airline industry in 1950, this would be kind of a shock to the system if we were thinking of it from nowadays, right? And some of it's the fact that people are demanding more, and we can see that in different parts of the world where people demand less. But I think as a supply side, I can think of some certain demand side things. Regional airline service, right? Say in about 1980, you'll be flying around in a piston engine aircraft which is a supply side thing, but you would have had a demand side where the demand on some of these spokes was sufficiently low, you were flying around 30-seat aircraft, okay? Now we're into the world, you're flying 50, 70-seat regional jets, and not if you move from piston to turboprop to a jet fan, right, which is a huge supply side thing. The fact you've got increasing demand means you've got the density there to bring out these additional safety features. So I think it's mainly on the supply side, in my opinion. Hani, and then Jeff.
I found your framework very compelling in terms
Okay.
of the valuation of risk and so on. But a lot of it hinges on essentially saying, well, you and I may value safety differently.
Yes.
Knowing that there is some objective characterization of safety.
Right.
But in reality, we're really perceiving safety differently. There's a distribution of information as well, and a perception of safety, because people who are doing downhill skiing may not necessarily on black diamond slopes may not necessarily be perceiving that the safety of that particular activity. How do you reconcile perception of safety within this framework?
So I would say, just from a purely modeling point of view, the stuff at the beginning of the lecture would assume not only were people perfectly informed, but they were being rational about things. Now, we would value, I was conjecturing that we may differ in our values. Now, one of the market failures may be not only, even though we're well informed about what goes on, we're either being myopic ourselves as consumers in the sense that, man, this airfare is really cheap now, but then you turn up and it's a really scummy carrier, and when you're dead, you kind of you regret your decision. You be myopic over things. So, I mean, I do think in some ways there is a paternalistic aspect to this, which I haven't discussed. I didn't cut it out of the lecture for time reasons, which is kind of a paternalistic view here, which is kind of interesting. I was going to tell a story here. I heard from, and this country's going to go nameless, and the carriers are going to go nameless, right? There was a country where there were a lot of college kids would go off on vacation to some place which is an island, and they would go there, and they was equivalent of what this country's equivalent of spring break was, right? And you go there, and they wanted cheap airfares to get there, and there was a certain carrier that was providing service to here, and there was also the national flag carrier, which was much higher fares, much higher safety. And the Safety Regulatory Authority was considering whether they were going to ban this other carrier from landing in their country because it had a notoriously, not terrible reputation, but a worse reputation. And basically the implication here was that it wasn't necessarily that these college kids were ignorant of the fact that this firm had had many numerous and well-publicized failings, but they were paternalistically saying, hey, you know, you'll be willing to pay this, you're willing to buy the tickets, maybe you're reasonably well informed about this, but we don't feel that this risk is too large. So there is a paternalistic side to this as well. I've seen some of the literature out of England where they talk about unreasonable risk, where you're going to get rid of a risk at any rate. The probabilities they're talking about there are not in anything we ever run into in transportation. So I think it's, but I think there's a similar concept going on. So I think there is paternalism going on here. And that's an interesting question. If you've got people who are fully informed, that was Corwin Edwards' comment, right? People know what they're getting and they know what they're getting into. They're kind of adults, right? Who are we to stop them, right? So, I mean, I do think that's an important issue. Yeah?
It would be interesting to think about how this discussion would resonate with some other cultures. For example, in a conversation with a high executive in an Asian air carrier, the topic was implementation of measures to manage the risk.
Yeah.
And the guy said, the problem with you Westerners is you only care about results. You don't care about relationships. So you've got yet another factor other than cost, other than the fear of a bad outcome.
Yeah.
You've got a group that considers relationships, and then, so that's another hurdle.
Yeah. I just think that my take here is that, actually I lost my train of thought, I'm sorry. I think the cultural thing here actually is the way economists might view this. If you came from other social sciences, you might be outraged by some of what we said here. The fact that we are deciding that certain incidents we're just not going to avoid. You know, so there's going to be, economists are these people who get bad reputation because there's always some optimal level of pollution, always some optimal level of congestion, most of which usually isn't zero, right? And there's going to be some level of crashes which we're going to tolerate because we can't spend all our GDP eradicating these. So, I mean, I find that probably the problem we have here is when economists are talking to people who come from other disciplines on this. So that's my take. Yeah?
I'm curious where you think the condition of, let's say, the public infrastructure would fit in a certain impact on safety.
Oh, that's true, isn't it? And that's the question was about the public infrastructure. So basically here we have a model where you've got the consumers, you've got the carriers, but then in the world you have, which is, of course is the world, apart from say a railroad, where you've got, it owns its own infrastructure, nearly every other one, which is the highway or the airport runways or something, you've then got the infrastructure provider as well, which usually often has monopoly characteristics to it. So I mean, so at least in terms of what that's providing to the various carriers, this is one size fits all. So when you go out on the highway, well, the highway's the highway, right? But trucking firms may be different in terms of the safety of the bits that they can control here. I mean, certainly that's one aspect of it. I mean, I do think the fact that these commonalities mean that you're going to end up with a lot more consistency between different safety levels. You know, if you're in the airline industry, the fact you're buying large planes from two companies means that, in effect, you are already narrowing down the ranges of what you can be doing, right? And in the railroad industry, it's even more in the fact that the guys are interchanging their equipment between each other all the time. So you've actually now got constraints between the companies in the sense that they're actually sharing locomotives and wagons between them. So it's, I think that's where the infrastructure comes into this. Now, of course, there always is a question which is a cost-benefit issue, which is at what level should you be providing the infrastructure? I think it's a lot easier question when you're actually dealing with a monopoly than it is where you're trying to figure out when firms are strategically interacting with each other to offer a variety of safety options. Yeah, please.
I'm wondering if you have a comment on the impact of big data on your research and the study of this. For example, incidents happen really relatively infrequently,
Right.
air travel, for example. But on the other hand, near misses and narrow escapes, could be tracked at a level of detail that is inconceivable today.
Ultimately, that's the question is about bigger data. I mean, one of the big problems you have about any sort of information to consumers is the fact that incidents occur very rarely, particularly if the firms you're dealing with are relatively small. You talk about an average trucking firm, might have 3 power units or something like this. Even if you're really scummy, you're not going to have many fatal incidents or serious injury crashes in a 10-year period. So you're always looking at precursor events, which is kind of interesting from an information point of view, because then the consumer then has to try and translate what does those data on the precursor events mean in reality, right? If I see data on engine shutdowns in flight for an airline case, right? What does that actually mean if I'm trying to think about that as a buyer? I do think you have things, say, the railroad industry, where you can look at employee injury data, which is there's a lot of employee injuries happen, right? And I think that is something which you might take as a proxy or a precursor event for predicting things in the future. Because half of the problem you think about is if you were telling consumers data so they could make safety choices, it's a bit like the warning on the stock market that past performance doesn't guarantee the future. If you have these incentives to cheat, what you did for safety in the last 10 years might mean nothing if this firm's going to go and cheat you tomorrow, right? But if you have data on precursor events, i.e. how many layers of Swiss cheese have they got in there and how many are they pulling out, if you have some things on there, then they might be telling you about what might be happening tomorrow. So, I mean, that's certainly an issue. I mean, I do think that in a lot of transportation injuries, if you look at employee injury data, you have more data. And I think you probably get better time trends to look at. Yes, other questions?
Ian.
Yes. Hi.
Coming from a trucker's perspective, obviously, one of the things that's impactful is tort.
Yeah.
Tort reform. As context, and we're not proud of this, but a jury awarded for $36.5 million last year in California for an accident that we had, which is it's a big number. And so as you think about safety, there's a cost impact in addition to the impact on people's lives. Mm-hmm. I mean, in terms of statutory law and tort, how do you think about that? And as you've done the work over the last, the years since I was a student with you.
Yeah, and we didn't have.
I did not write that assessment, but it's pretty much the same thing I was.
Thank you, Paul. We didn't have the safety lecture in those days. We had the one on the value of life. The interesting thing is, if we'd done that value of life thing, which is like 92 or 94, was it? Right? At that time, the US Department of Transportation's advice was like 1.5 million, I think, at that time. The most recent advice, obviously you had inflation there, is now up to 9 million. So I see there's an escalation in the valuation that's being quoted here. So much so that I find it kind of tough to know what's going on. I mean, I understand where they're coming from. Most of it's coming from labour market studies, where there is some background on that. But coming back to your question, I mean, I guess the thing that concerns me most of all is when there are certain externalities which just do not end up with the firm, or the firm just gets out of them. I mean, if you declare bankruptcy in the face of 50 people being dead in a bar in Quebec, then obviously that externality is not coming back to you. And I think so I think that's the concern. I mean, you're bringing up issue of whether juries award too much or too little, right, in certain cases, right? I think in most cases, if you look across every award, most legal awards end up being much less than what the Department of Transportation's advice of 9 million is. Okay? So you're seeing one end of a distribution. There's a whole bunch of other ones which are way down at the bottom. I never see on data, I know it's somewhat in airline cases that most settlements ended up, this was many years ago, probably under $1 million on average, I think, probably, per fatality. I think that's probably when people have gone and looked at, so that's my take on that.
Okay, thank you very much, Ian. Please,
Thank you.